Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight as we wrap up our fall speaker series. But don't worry, there is more to come. We have speakers planned for the spring, and we also have more activities planned at the museum and in the community throughout the winter. So if you're interested in finding out what all's going on, you can subscribe to our email list. I will post a link in the chat here in a minute. Just a few quick tips for tonight's program. If you've watched in the past and you've had some connection issues, it helps if you're on a wired connection, either to your TV or your computer. If you don't have that, though, try switching to YouTube instead of Facebook. YouTube is a little bit more stable of a platform, so that might help your options out a little bit more. I'll also post a link to the YouTube channel here in a second as well. You can still do comments from both platforms, so feel free to leave us messages throughout the program. And there will be a live Q&A to follow, so feel free to comment with any questions you'd like answered as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome our speaker tonight, Stephen Heyman. Let me add him in here.
Hi, everyone.
Stephen is the former features editor at T, the New York Times style magazine. He's written for The Times, Slate, Vogue, and many other publications. In 2018, he was named a fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. He lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Stephen, and let you get started.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure for me to talk to a lot of people in Ohio, where this story is at least partly set. I heard the name Louis Bromfield for the first time 5 years ago. I had just moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with my wife, who came here for graduate school. And I'm a journalist, and I was looking for a story, and I happened to meet a lamb farmer. And I was interviewing him, and he kind of mentioned offhandedly this guy, Bromfield, who had been an inspiration to him when he got started farming in the 1970s. I wrote the name down in my notebook, and I got home, and I typed into Google, and I fell down this marvelous rabbit hole where I discovered somebody who had been enormously consequential in two divergent fields. He had been a real pioneer of sustainable agriculture, and his farm, Malabar, was incredibly famous in mid-century America. E.B. White wrote an ode about it in the New Yorker magazine, and Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall got married there in 1945. But what amazed me about Bromfield was that he was not only a very significant figure in terms of agriculture and environmentalism, but he had this extraordinary earlier life as a Pulitzer Prize-winning Lost Generation novelist, hanging out in Paris between the wars with people like Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway. So I was amazed at that this person could combine these two very different interests, literature and agriculture, France and Ohio. And then I was doubly amazed that he could just kind of vanish from popular memory. So I started working on a book. It took me 5 years, and I'm just going to kind of take you today through some of the high points of the story. So I want to begin in 1920s Paris. Here you have Bromfield in the center, pictured beside two of his best-known contemporaries, Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, all three of these guys are Midwesterners. All three of them headed east in search of what the literary critic Malcolm Cawley called new prairies of the mind. Bromfield, like Fitzgerald, was an Ivy League dropout. Like Hemingway, he was a World War I ambulance driver. And he, Hemingway and Fitzgerald are, of course, much better known today than Bromfield. But at this point, when they all met in Paris in the 1920s, Bromfield was in a comparatively stronger position. Hemingway was in the process of trying to get his literary career off the ground. He was an ex-newspaperman working on his first novel. And Fitzgerald had just published The Great Gatsby, but he was crushed by the novel's weak sales. And he actually wrote his editor in December of 1925 and said, "Is Gatsby dead?" Little did he know that it would become the quintessential American novel. But Bromfield, as I mentioned, was riding high at this time. The New York Times pronounced him the best of all the young American novelists writing in that period. He had published 2 best-selling novels. They interestingly featured female protagonists. They were these women, strong-willed, independent-minded women who were trying to break free from their stultifying Midwestern backgrounds. Usually they did this by reconnecting with nature or moving to Europe, as Bromfield did. So he settled in Paris in 1925, and he didn't take the typical lost generation trajectory. He didn't rent an apartment, some garret on the left bank, but instead he used the proceeds from his best-selling novels to rent a grand apartment overlooking the Bois de Boulogne. And you can see some photographs of him. This is him on the left, painting landscapes in the Bois. At the right, you have him sitting in his apartment reading his newspaper. You'll notice the cat there on his lap. He was a big animal lover even at this stage in his life. Below, you see a photograph of him dancing in the Basque Country with his friend, the playwright Edna Ferber. So Bromfield really loved life in France. He thought the delights of Paris were inexhaustible. I mentioned Hemingway before. Bromfield had a fascinating relationship with Hemingway. Bromfield's third novel, Early Autumn, and Hemingway's first, The Sun Also Rises, were published within 1 week of each other in October of 1926. And Bromfield's novel, it delighted all of the mainstream critics. It made it to the top of the bestseller list. It went on to win the 1926 Pulitzer Prize, which was awarded early in 1927. Hemingway's novel, which of course now is seen as a masterpiece, at the time received kind of mixed reviews, and his hometown newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, dismissed it as a bushel of sensationalism and triviality. So, this depressed the hell out of Hemingway. And Hemingway and Bromfield had been hanging out together quite a bit. They met at a party hosted by Ford Madox Ford. And then Bromfield, was extremely hospitable and generous toward Hemingway, had him over at his apartment, fed him, numerous times, was a real gracious host. And Hemingway kind of cozied up to him, but he wrote these vicious letters to Fitzgerald and to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, where he just tore Bromfield apart, savaged his work. And I think that this pettiness concealed a really intense jealousy on Hemingway's part. He wrote this amazing letter to his editor, complaining about the reception of The Sun Also Rises. And he said that he cut 40,000 words out of the original manuscript for that book, which would have pleased the critics, but would have rung as false 10 years from now as Bromfield. So Hemingway, in his way, understood that for all the charms of Bromfield's novels, for all their popularity with readers at the time, Bromfield was not a modernist, and Hemingway thought his work wouldn't survive. And I linger on this moment because I think that it's the moment, certainly in my book, where it becomes clear that Bromfield is not modern and perhaps not durable as a literary figure, but will eventually kind of reveal himself to be a modernist of another kind, a modernist when it comes to his relationship with the land, a modernist when it comes to farming and the environment. Eventually, he tires of the literary scene in Paris, and in the late 1920s settles in a medieval town to the north of Paris called Senlis, where he rents an old rectory and begins to lay out a beautiful garden along a river called the Nonette. And you can see some photographs of the garden. These are from the scrapbooks, the Bromfield family scrapbooks at Ohio State University. So you'll see on the bottom left, this is an old chapel, part of the Bromfield property right along the river. You see some rows of flowers. There's a nice shot of Bromfield photographing his arrangement of dahlias. And below that picture, you see the Bromfield family. That is Bromfield at center. Then his eldest daughter, Anne. Hope is in the middle. That is his wife, Mary. And then the youngest daughter, Ellen. Ellen, whom I had a chance to meet when she was much older, before she died. She passed away last year. Okay, moving on. Bromfield builds this beautiful garden, and the garden becomes a kind of literary salon, and it attracts all kinds of people. And in these photos, you can see some of those people. In the top left, you have Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas sitting in the jungle room of Bromfield's house with murals that Bromfield painted along with his wife. To the right of that photo is a picture of Bromfield standing next to Elsa Schiaparelli, the famous fashion designer. Below her is Janet Flanner, the New Yorker correspondent, and to the right, Ina Claire, the stage and screen actress. So all these people kind of jumbled together in Bromfield's garden. He had a very Catholic taste in people, and he found lots of different types of people interesting. Two friendships from this period stand out. The first is with Gertrude Stein. Here she is standing on the rose-covered bridge that spanned the river by Bromfield's house. And Stein adored Bromfield. They certainly talked a lot about literature and politics, but they especially talked about gardening. Stein had a country house, and there are these adorable letters that she sent to Bromfield asking for tips on how to, improve their vegetables and herbs. And she pleaded with him to come down to help spruce up the vegetable patch. The other important friendship from this period is with Edith Wharton, who lived not far from Senlis in a town called Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, where she had a very grand house, and she designed beautiful gardens. Bromfield and Wharton really had a kind of platonic love affair that was really rooted in the earth. They lunched with garden designers like Lawrence Johnston. They visited flower breeders together. They exchanged cuttings and seeds, and they were competitive. There's a funny quote from Wharton where she writes to Bromfield, "If you could see my peonies and California irises here now, you'd drown yourself in the Nonette." Again, the Nonette is the river outside of Bromfield's place. And so Bromfield says of his friendship with Wharton, we seldom discussed our writing, but we talked frequently and at great length of our dahlias and petunias, our green peas and lettuces. I think it's just extraordinary that you have two Pulitzer Prize-winning American novelists living in France, and yet the substance of their friendship is flowers, not literature. Anyways, moving on. Here's another shot of Wharton's Garden at Saint-Brice, and you know, you're getting just to give you a sense of the formality here. The design was arranged in stages. There was this long gravel terrace dotted with flower pots and simple lawn furniture. There were dwarf orange trees, jasmine, lavender, parterres. It was, you know, the overall impression was one of severe splendor. Now, as much as Bromfield admired Wharton's formal gardens and the parterres and all that, he was ultimately more appealed by the kind of French peasant-style gardening practiced by his neighbors in Senlis. And here is a guy named Piquet in the bottom left, who taught Bromfield kind of all the tricks of French peasant families who were able to pull just a bounty of food from these scruffy little plots of land. Bromfield was amazed at the kind of reverence they brought to the land, the way they recycled organic material, you know, the almost sacred approach they had to manure. Bromfield said of Piquet that he knew everything about gardening, but his only foible was that if he didn't watch him, he would put down the entire garden in leeks, the backbone of all great French soups. You know, Bromfield working this land by the river in Senlis is amazed at the fertility of the land, which had been under constant cultivation for 1,000 years or more. And, you know, his family were farming people from Ohio, and he knew that American farmers were capable of exhausting virgin farmland, virgin soil, in the space of 1 or 2 generations. So he knew that, you know, that there was something to be learned in the French approach to the soil. And, you know, we have to remember the context, the larger kind of geopolitical context at this time. Bromfield is gardening in France and taking tea with Edith Wharton at a moment when the world is on fire. There is horrible dust storms in the Great Plains. There's a widespread incidence of cotton erosion in the South. On the right here, you have an eroded cotton field caused by bad farming practices in Alabama. So, you know, the Great Depression is on, and he's watching all this happen from the comfort of Europe, and he's thinking about his own family story, and it produces a kind of real crisis in him, where he starts to question the trajectory of his work and his life. And I want to read to you an excerpt from my book, which talks about this moment. Okay. Sitting in his lush garden outside Paris, Bromfield was overwhelmed by the suffering and waste caused by this man-made crisis. The news fed into his own sense of ennui, his personal depression. His shimmering arrival on the literary scene, the Pulitzer Prize, the breathless comparisons to Fielding and Balzac, was now all behind him. His latest books were trifles, droll stories of expatriate life, half-hearted genre experiments. Each became a bestseller, Each earned a few critical plaudits, each satisfied nearly everyone but himself. His sojourn in Hollywood in 1930 left him disgusted by the hollowness of American culture. Herbert Hoover's heartless, ham-fisted response to the economic crisis depressed him further. Paris and the fashionable ski resorts had lost their glamour. The literary cafes had lost their lure. He stayed at home in Senlis, relishing only his garden. In an essay, he took stock of his position. He had retreated from an America blatantly represented by Wall Street into the greater quiet of Europe. Yet his mind, depressed and searching, had become one long query, a great why, a great what is it all about? To answer these questions, Bromfield began to write a book that was entirely unlike his earlier novels. It would be a family history written as a lament. It would track the true story of the rise and fall of the Bromfield family farm in Ohio. But, he told Cass Canfield, his new editor at Harper, it would also tell a larger story about how industry replaced agriculture as the linchpin of American society. Bromfield believed that this development explained the cultural defect at the heart of the Great Depression. He saw his family's farm and the proud rural culture it represented as the embodiment of Jefferson's agrarian vision for America, in which freedom and democracy supposedly flourished in a society composed of self-sufficient yeoman farmers. This version of America had lost out to the merchant-based plutocracy of Alexander Hamilton, who had opened the door to big banks and speculative schemes that had now driven the country to the brink of financial ruin. Bromfield wanted to weave this political parable into his family's story to write not only a nostalgic paean to a vanished agrarian world, but also a polemic, railing against the pollution and rapaciousness of big business, the priggish, small-minded townsfolk he grew up with, the flavorless conveniences they celebrated as progress. Bromfield opened the book with a long dedication addressed to his 3 children, the eldest of whom, Anne, was then just 8. It explained that this story was not only a record of the self-sufficient pastoral world that his grandparents built, but also a call to recapture it. The farm is the story of a way of living which has largely gone out of fashion, save in a few half-forgotten quarters and a few families which stuck to it with an admirable stubbornness in spite of everything. It has in it 2 fundamentals which were once and may be again intensely American characteristics. These are integrity and idealism. Jefferson has been dead for more than 100 years, and there is no longer any frontier, but the things which both represent are immortal. They are tough qualities needed in times of crisis. So, this novel slash memoir, The Farm, published in 1933, it becomes a huge bestseller. Gertrude Stein thinks it's the best thing that Bromfield ever wrote. It really captures the imagination of lots of Americans, many of whom grew up on farms, some of whom are being dispossessed of their land when the book comes out. It will later make a deep impression on some agrarian thinkers like Wendell Berry. Edith Wharton is less impressed by this book and alarmed when Bromfield starts talking about how he wants to leave France and perhaps move back to America and perhaps buy a farm. And she writes him, "I wish that writing a book called The Farm wouldn't immediately make you decide to buy one. If action always follows so rapidly on thought, you will have an agitated existence. And so will Mary." Mary is Bromfield's wife. And indeed, he had a very agitated existence. One more chapter before we get to Malabar, and that is India. Bromfield took 2 long trips to India while he lived in Europe. These both were very important. They allowed him to connect with a man, he's pictured in the bottom left, named Albert Howard, who is considered to be the founding father of the organic movement. Bromfield visited his soil institute and was very taken with his agricultural ideas. India also gave Bromfield inspiration for one of his most successful novels, The Rains Came, which was turned into a 1939 blockbuster film. In the bottom photograph, you can see a huge line of moviegoers waiting to get into Bromfield's film in New York City. And he also fell in love with a mongoose whom he named Rikki Tikki Tavi and brought back to France, and he became quite the conversation piece in the garden. And of course, India was very important in that it gave Bromfield the money through this very successful film to finance his farm in Ohio, which he later called Malabar, giving it an Indian name because, as he said, India made it possible. So in 1938, Bromfield returns to America. He decides to go back to Ohio. He wants to raise his kids on an honest-to-God farm. He's traveling through the countryside that he knew as a boy. The Pleasant Valley, which you folks know very well, is covered in snow. He sees an old stone farmhouse, which he likes quite a bit. He buys it. He buys all the barns. He buys the surrounding pastures. He wants to build a self-sufficient farm, which is going to be like the medieval fortress manor of France, a place where a whole community could find security and self-sufficiency, a place which, if necessary, can withstand a siege. So he's very romantic ideas for what this farm could be. And he begins to lay out a very elaborate kind of Jeffersonian Greek revival 19-room farmhouse with an architect from Mansfield. But when the snow melts in the spring of 1939, Bromfield realizes the land on which he wants to build his dream farm is practically worthless. The sandy, loose, alluvial topsoil had been washed off the hills by rain and wind, and there were gullies dug so deep you could lose a horse inside them. And Bromfield is obviously extremely upset. And he's totally overwhelmed because nothing in his experience, whether it was working on his grandfather's farm as a boy or gardening in France or writing that romantic novel, The Farm, has prepared him to reclaim these 600 acres. So he gets in touch with a smart guy named Max Drake from Ohio State, who was hooked up with some New Deal era organizations like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Soil Conservation Service, which were doing some really exciting things on the cutting edge of soil science, creating all these demonstration farms and showing farmers around the country how poor land could be made rich again. Bromfield at this moment, we have to remember the war is coming. He's in high demand in Hollywood. He's building his fancy dream house, and he's also somewhat at this point interested in agriculture, but not enough to devote himself full time to what's happening on the farm. So he kind of gives Drake carte blanche, or at least that's what Drake thinks is happening. And Drake has the CCC people and the soil conservation people refit the land and bulldoze the gullies and kind of remake Malabar. And Bromfield comes back from one of his many trips to Hollywood and sees his farm in a state of transformation, and he freaks out and explodes at Drake, curses him out. Drake thinks he's fired. Bromfield storms off to the big house, but then he cools off and he comes back and he asks Drake, well, what's happening here? What are you doing? And Drake begins to kind of give him his first lessons in soil conservation. And this begins the process by which Bromfield is transformed from a globe-trotting literary playboy into an evangelist for what he calls the new agriculture. And in the subsequent years, Malabar is transformed from this eroded hill farm into an agrarian paradise. And it becomes a showcase for a lot of agricultural techniques that are the foundation of what we would now call sustainable and organic agriculture. These are things like the use of cover crops so that fields don't remain bare in the off season, plowing crops on the natural contour of the land instead of straight up and down, which cuts down on soil erosion, large-scale composting of the kind that he saw at Albert Howard's Soil Institute in India. Trash farming, which is a kind of predecessor of no-till agriculture, where you leave the vegetal residue of previous crops on the soil, again to cut down erosion and plant into that organic material, and grass farming. So you feed cattle on grass instead of grain, which was popular at the time. A technique which is, better for the land, and nutritionists would say better for consumers of meat today. So Bromfield was very much ahead of his time, and while he didn't invent any of these techniques, Malabar became an amazing platform for popularizing them. But it wasn't just Malabar. Bromfield spearheaded an organization called the Friends of the Land, which is this remarkable group of people that got together just around the outbreak of World War II. And it was a group of like-minded conservationists, people like Hugh Bennett and Aldo Leopold and Paul Sears. And they started chapters all around the country. They had a influential journal called The Land. They financed documentaries, and they went on these barnstorming trips. And Bromfield was the star speaker. The Friends of the Land, like so much about this story, have been entirely forgotten. They don't even have a Wikipedia page today. But I think that they are one of the first organizations to really mainstream environmentalism in the modern sense and talk about the interconnectedness of all living things. And again, the Friends of the Land raised the profile of Malabar and conducted a lot of events there. Here you see a photograph of Bromfield preaching the gospel of soil conservation from the top of Mount Gees, which you folks probably know very well. It's the highest point at Malabar, a beautiful vantage where you can see the whole farm. Bromfield was very early in warning Americans about the dangers posed by pesticides like DDT. He came out against DDT in 1945, 17 years before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And he correctly understood that these substances weren't only harmful in themselves, they also upset the kind of balance of nature, creating a kind of arms race between man and pests, where you had to invent ever more stronger substances to combat the natural resistance that bugs and weeds and things like that could develop. So Bromfield really cautioned against an over-reliance on chemicals, and I think he was very prophetic in that regard. He also, in a testimony to Congress in the 1950s, envisioned a future in which food companies would print a special label on their products to verify that their foods had not been touched by chemicals, very similar to the organic label that the USDA has today. Bromfield's interests were not confined to agriculture and the environment. Here is a remarkable telegram that he sent to Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House in 1943, trying to get her to raise awareness about the Holocaust as it was happening. Bromfield was an ardent defender of the Jewish people. One of many examples of him kind of being on the right side of history. Although he wasn't always correct in his pronouncements, he, in the midst of World War II, started a national panic about an imminent food famine that never came, and critics called him the prophet of starvation. The most famous event that happened in Malabar was the 1945 wedding of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Bromfield was a close friend of Bogart's, was very charmed by Bacall. But I think that, he shrewdly capitalized on this friendship and this event to yet again raise the profile of Malabar and get people interested in the conservation mission. One more thing before I take questions. After Bromfield's wife Mary died in the early 1950s, he struck up a relationship with the billionaire heiress Doris Duke. It's interesting how this relationship began. Basically, Duke had read Bromfield's farming books, and she had a major case of Dutch elm disease on her sprawling New Jersey farm. And so she got in touch with Bromfield to see if he could save her trees. He told her that the trees had to go, but in talking, they realized they liked each other quite a bit. And they fell in love and had an interesting romance that unfortunately was cut short because of Bromfield's illness. And one of the exciting discoveries that I made in researching this book was just how close their relationship was. Bromfield spent a lot of time staying at Duke's place in New Jersey, and she personally injected him with his medicine. She apparently had some nursing experience. Bromfield wrote some beautiful love letters to her, including one that I think was basically written on his deathbed. He collapsed on the farm in March of 1956, was taken to Columbus, where he later died at a hospital. So before I leave you, I want to linger on Bromfield's love of animals. He had this concept of being tetched. This is a kind of like rural slang term, like a variant on touched, which meant a little crazy. But Bromfield took it to mean not exactly crazy, but having a kind of uncanny ability to blend into the pattern of life and to feel connected with plants and with animals. I love this photograph of a little raccoon coiled around his neck. But famously, he loved boxer dogs, and he had a multi-generational clan of drooling boxer dogs at Malabar, and he slept with them, and they followed him around the farm, and they became kind of the mascots of Malabar, as you folks probably know very well. Bromfield wrote so beautifully about Malabar in all of his farm books, but I think for me, the piece of writing that really evokes the place is E.B. White's ode, which I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm just going to read you one stanza as a little parting gift. This is E.B. White on Malabar. A farm is always in some kind of tizzy, but Bromfield's place is really busy. Strangers arriving by every train, Bromfield terracing against the rain, catamounts crying, mowers mowing, guest rooms full to overflowing, boxers in every room of the house, cows being milked to Brahms and Strauss, kids arriving by van and pung, Bromfield up to his eyes in dung, sailors, trumpeters, mystics, actors, all of them wanting to drive the tractors, all of them eager to husk the corn, some of them sipping their drinks till morn. Okay, thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much for that. It's very interesting.
Cool.
So we'll go ahead and start the question and answer. Of course, we'll give you guys a couple minutes to go ahead and type those in. So whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can comment live on the video, assuming you're watching it Monday night. It's currently 7:43 p.m. Eastern. If you're watching it later, then we are no longer live. But while those questions come in, I guess I'll go ahead and get us started. So this is a two-part. What is your favorite Bromfield book or story? And if different, which one would you recommend for someone who has never read Bromfield before?
Well, I think it's like, it depends what you're after. If you're interested in Bromfield's work as a kind of novelist, I would say my favorite is The Rains Came, that novel of India I mentioned, which was turned into a very successful movie in 1939. I think that he really infects you with his enthusiasm for that place. You can get a sense of the lived experience of visiting there, and it is a very nuanced portrait. You know, there's an interesting letter that I found from an Indian freedom fighter, an associate of Gandhi, who said that The Rains Came was the first real novel of India by a non-Indian that he knew of. So that's my favorite of Bromfield's novels. But I think that for me, you know, I'm more interested in his kind of agricultural and environmental writings. And so there I would say start with Pleasant Valley, his 1945 memoir, which kind of describes a bit of the trajectory that I was talking about. It also features one of the, I think, most romantic stories, which really conveys Bromfield's love for farming, and that's called My 90 Acres. And it's about an old farmer who actually a kind of fictionalized character, but a farmer who lost his wife, but finds her again in his love for the land. It's a beautiful story, just slightly mawkishly sentimental, but not too bad when it comes to Bromfield. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. The My 90 Acres part of Pleasant Valley is probably one of his more passionate stories.
Yeah, totally.
So we've got some questions coming in, including a comment from Diane on Facebook. She found a copy of your book at the library and fell in love. She couldn't put it down. And she later mentioned that now she is also borrowing multiple books by Bromfield to learn more about him.
That's wonderful. Wonderful to hear. Thank you so much.
And June on YouTube is asking if you'll be coming back to Mansfield in person anytime.
As soon as I'm able. I sadly had a reading scheduled at the wonderful bookstore in Mansfield, Main Street Books, which has since closed. I was sorry to have that canceled, like so many things by the pandemic, but I'd love to come back. I want to go to Malabar. I want to talk about the story and the place where it's set. So it's been difficult for me not to be able to do that, but as soon as I'm able, I will be there.
All right. And Matt on Facebook is, why did Bromfield fall out of popularity and I assume modern memory?
It's such a complicated question. I think that, I think people in his time didn't really understand how the different pieces of his life fit together. The literary critics wanted, a novelist who was interested in art for art's sake. They thought that his farming enterprise was the plaything of a dilettante. The environmentalists, whose politics tend to kind of lean left, might have been confused by Bromfield's political leanings, which are like, they're a little bit farther to the right and kind of all over the map. And ordinary farmers might have been put off by his pretensions, his high society Hollywood connections. So I think he was a confusing figure, and I think that his project makes a lot more sense today, when food and the environment are seen as such central questions. But in his time, they were not seen that way. And so I think people were a little bit confused by his trajectory.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned at the beginning of your program when Hemingway cut something like 40,000 words out of his novel, and mentioned that Bromfield's won't be, nearly as popular in 10 years.
Yes.
I think the writing styles are a big part of that as well.
Totally. I think that Bromfield, wrote in a kind of post-Victorian style, which was already old-fashioned when he was writing, and has, maybe not aged as well. Although I find his novels charming, I think that there's still a lot to be, a lot we can appreciate there. But I think that when you look at a book like The Sun Also Rises, leaving aside the kind of sexual politics of that novel, it reads like it was written yesterday, and that's certainly not true of Bromfield's work.
Yeah. Let's see. Did Bromfield regret touting multiflora rose at the behest of the U.S. Department of Ag? Obviously, she mentions here, I'm not sure how familiar you are, but many local farmers curse his name whenever they come across it.
Well, Jennifer, I love this question, and I especially appreciate the fact that you noted that it was at the behest of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because I think that Bromfield, I mentioned that how successful he was in popularizing a lot of ideas of conservation and what we would now call sustainable or regenerative agriculture. But often he did not come up with these ideas, and he was relying on the kind of opinions of agronomists and people who had devoted their lives to the science of soil and conservation. And so he was very excited about multiflora, but it was recommended by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, and so I think he's unfairly blamed for its unfortunate legacy as an invasive species. But I think it is a thorny part of his legacy. But I don't think he deserves as much blame as he's perhaps given. I don't know whether he regrets it. I don't know whether he lived long enough to understand that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be.
Let's see. This kind of goes back to the previous question. 1 second, just jumped around on me there. Did Bromfield regret falling out of the literary spotlight, and did alcoholism play a part in his death?
Okay. I think that, did he regret falling out of the literary spotlight? He had this whole act in the 1950s that that writing novels was just a way of making a living. And as far as he was concerned, not a particularly self-respecting one. He treated literature with kind of contempt in the early 1950s. And when I say literature, I mean his fiction. I think he brought a lot of love and care to his agricultural writing. That might have been an act, that might have been a defensive posture to some extent, because he had been so badly mistreated by popular critics in the 1940s, like Edmund Wilson and Orville Prescott from the New York Times, for instance. But I think that he genuinely was engaged in a very serious agricultural and environmental mission, and he did see literature as a way of funding it. So I think that's kind of how he regarded his novel writing later in life. And the other part of the question was, his death. Yeah, he definitely drank a ton. I'm sure that contributed in part to his untimely death. Although, he had multiple myeloma, kind of bone marrow cancer, and he got very sick in a short period of time, and that's what ultimately kills him.
What type of relationship did Bromfield have with Ohio State School of Agriculture?
Very good question. I'm, aside from seeing a lot of Ohio State letterheads as I was kind of going through the archives, I really wouldn't be able to answer that because it wasn't a focus of my book. I mentioned that Max Drake, his farm manager, had gone to Ohio State and was connected with the Soil Conservation Service, but I'm not exactly sure what relationship Bromfield had with OSU. I know that there were a lot of like soil research stations near Malabar that he was in contact with, but he was in contact with people from all around the world and all around the country. So that's an interesting avenue of research for people who are focused on those questions.
You mentioned that some of his, I believe, family collection is at Ohio State Archives. Yeah. Do you know why they're there?
I think that Bromfield left it to Ohio State. Okay. I'm not exactly sure how all of that material ended up there, what that legal process was like. Yeah, so I'm not sure. But yes, the collections are extensive. There's a lot of really wonderful materials, a lot of fantastic photographs.
Let's see. So this one is actually, someone missed the beginning of your talk. If you'd be able to quickly cover what created your interest in Bromfield again.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned that I was interviewing a lamb farmer in southwestern Pennsylvania who mentioned Bromfield, and then I kind of did a cursory internet search about him and was amazed at this incredible life he led. But, personally, the reason why I was interested in him, I lived in France for a time. I've always been interested in the American experience in France. I'm also super interested in food. I initially got interested in food because I love to eat because it was pleasurable. But as I read more about it, I realized that this is this thing that brings me pleasure is also incredibly complicated in a kind of political, social, moral, ecological way. And I had read, I think, Bromfield's heirs, people like Wendell Berry and Michael Pollan. And so when I discovered him, that he had been talking about some of the similar things so much earlier, and also had this kind of incredible expatriate experience in France as a novelist, I was amazed at the story and amazed that no one had kind of done it. So I thought that it was a book that I wanted to read, and ultimately that's why I wrote it.
All right.
Yeah.
So this one essentially is, do you know anything about a French foreign exchange student who spent time at Malabar?
No. Although it's very plausible. I think that, let me see, a French foreign exchange student. No, I don't. I think, okay, so I remember that there was a French intern in the dairy. I want to say his name was Gaspard. I'm not sure. But that sounds like something that could have easily happened. Yeah.
All right. Back to multiflora rose.
Yes.
Do you know, is it an actual rose?
Do I know if it's actual? I have no idea.
I don't either.
I'm not, the truth is I'm not like much of a horticultural expert. I had to do a lot of quick study for this book. So I'm not sure whether it's part of the rose family. I do know that it grew very high and that people wanted to use it as kind of natural fencing to cut down on soil erosion, to separate pastures. It seemed like a really good idea. And then, of course, it's tortured generations of backyard gardeners and farmers because I guess birds eat the fruits and scatter them, and then it spreads. Multiflora, no good.
Diane and anyone else wondering the answer to that, Google might be able to help you. Otherwise, I'd suggest calling Malabar Farm State Park. One of their naturalists there might be able to help you out with that. And our final question, you kind of already went over this. What was Miss Duke giving him injections for? You mentioned bone marrow cancer.
Yeah.
If you want to expand on that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I mentioned that was just to kind of illustrate how intimate their relationship was. That she continued to care for him after he got sick. And this was something that I found in a letter that Bromfield had written to his secretary, where he described Duke giving him his injections. He was being treated at a doctor's hospital in New York City for what he described as a tropical illness that he contracted while visiting his daughter's farm in Brazil. I think he was trying to spin it in a kind of exotic and romantic direction. But the truth is that he was very sick with cancer. And I think trying an experimental drug, Duke was giving him an injection. This was in early 1956. And he later went back to his farm and died in March. So, but yeah, the reason I mentioned that was just to kind of talk about how close they were.
All right. There's quite a few comments. They're not quite questions, but interesting comments that you can go back and read. People complimenting your book or the stories. I said the last one was the last one, but this is a good one to end on. Bruce wants to know, what is your next project?
Oh, well, Bruce, I do have a figure for our next biography in my sights, but it's too early to talk about. And in the meantime, I'm just doing a variety of different journalistic tasks while also trying to raise my son, who's 6 months old and a handful, and deal with the various complications of 2020. So I've got plenty to do. I did have a garden on my patio. It's looking very sad right now because of the weather, but I hope to get back at it in the spring. I'm hoping for great things in the spring of 2021. And I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me and to hear about this story.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I don't have a copy in front of me to hold up, but for everyone at home, there we go. His book, The Planner of Modern Life, Louis Bromfield and the Seeds of a Food Revolution, came out earlier this year. It's a fantastic read. If you get the opportunity, I do know if you're local, they're selling it at Malabar Farm in the gift shop, or I'm sure you can buy it online or borrow it from your local library. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And of course, thank you, Stephen, for joining us, sharing your story. And if anyone is interested in more museum events, we did post the link. You can subscribe to our email newsletter, and we'll keep you updated on the next speaker series.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.